The hum of the primary server rack was the closest thing I had to a companion, a low, constant thrumming that resonated through the insulated floor of the Deep Space Observatory. Outside, the night was a vast, cold canvas, dotted with pinpricks of ancient light. But here, in the nerve center, it was all about the digital pulse, the relentless stream of cosmic data. My coffee, a dark, bitter brew, had long since gone cold in its ceramic mug, but I didn't mind. I rarely did. The solitude was a necessary ingredient for the kind of work I pursued, the kind of absolute focus required to coax secrets from the furthest reaches of existence. Conventional wisdom held these regions as barren, desolate expanses, devoid of significant matter or energy, the universe's quiet corners. The observatory, with its new generation interferometer array, was designed to challenge such assumptions, to listen for whispers where only silence was expected. I spent my nights sifting through the noise, searching for any deviation, any pattern, anything at all. Most nights it was just that, noise. The faint echo of the Big Bang, the hiss of distant radio galaxies, the statistical background hum of a universe in constant motion. Tonight, however, something snagged my attention, a subtle aberration in the real-time spectral analysis feed. My custom algorithms, designed to detect even the most minute, non-repeating energy fluctuations, usually spat out nothing but confirmation of its emptiness. But then, a flicker, a single, sharp peak on the low-frequency band, too crisp, too isolated to be stellar wind or background radiation. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. My fingers danced across the holographic interface, isolating the anomaly. My first thought was a glitch. Happens all the time. A stray cosmic ray hitting a sensor, a momentary power fluctuation, even a software bug. I ran a diagnostic on the array, cross-referencing the data against redundant systems. Everything checked out. The equipment was operating perfectly. Yet the spike remained, stubbornly etched into the spectral graph. It wasn't repeating. Not a pulse, not a burst. Just a single, distinct event, lasting mere milliseconds, then gone. I scrubbed back the timeline, replaying the sequence. There it was again, an abrupt, solitary signature. I tried to filter it, to smooth it out, to make it conform to known cosmic phenomena. It resisted. It wasn't random. It possessed an almost deliberate quality, a sharpness that defied the usual fuzzy chaos of the universe. My brow furrowed. I pulled up the raw data, a flood of numbers scrolling rapidly down the secondary screen. I'd seen countless patterns in my career, from the rhythmic dance of pulsars to the chaotic signatures of active galactic nuclei. This was different. This wasn't a pattern I recognized. It wasn't even like a pattern I recognized. It was a single, non-repeating sequence of modulated frequencies, complex and intricate, yet utterly without precedent. Impossible, I muttered, the word feeling too loud in the silent chamber. It was supposed to be the ultimate cosmic desert. No stars, no gas clouds, no known sources of such an energy signature. Yet here it was, undeniable, staring back at me from the heart of nothingness. I zoomed in further, trying to discern any underlying structure. The signal's complexity was astounding. It wasn't just a simple spike. It was a brief, almost impossibly dense packet of information compressed into an ephemeral burst. It was like finding a single, intricately carved jewel in the middle of an ocean. My rational mind screamed for a mundane explanation. A distant, previously uncatalogued gamma-ray burst. No, the frequency profile was all wrong. A gravitational wave transient. Again, the signature didn't match. A shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the observatory's climate control. The air suddenly felt heavier, the hum of the servers a little more insistent. I felt a prickle on my skin, an irrational sense of being watched, even though I was alone, millions of miles from any substantial human presence. My hands, usually so steady, hovered over the controls, a tremor running through them. It was just data, just a blip. But the sheer uniqueness of it, the way it defied every expectation, every physical model I knew, began to chip away at my composure. My fingers, almost against my conscious will, navigated to the logging interface. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the empty fields. Logging such an anomalous event, without any immediate, verifiable explanation, felt like an admission of something unsettling, something beyond my understanding. It felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, a path that led away from the comforting certainty of established science. But the nagging curiosity, a persistent, almost irritating itch beneath my skin, wouldn't let it go. What was it? Why here? The coordinates, the timestamp, the raw spectral data. All of it. The low thrum of the observatory's primary server rack, once a comforting lullaby, had morphed into a marking drone. It was a sound of routine, of predictable power, and the signal I'd captured was anything but routine. The more I analyzed the initial data, the clearer it became. This wasn't some cosmic fluke, no natural pulsars or distant quasars. This was something else entirely. My colleagues, still absorbed in their own celestial pursuits, wouldn't understand. They'd see noise, or worse, a miscalibration. The very idea of presenting this to them, this perfectly structured chaos from the void, felt like an act of sacrilege. It needed a different kind of scrutiny, a deeper silence than the observatory could offer. I made the arrangements quietly, using a research grant earmarked for unconventional data analysis, a conveniently vague title. It was as if its ancient presence chafed against the sleek, insulated walls. I needed a place where the air itself felt heavy with time, where the earth could absorb whatever strange energies this signal might emanate. That's how I found myself negotiating access to the catacombs beneath a forgotten cathedral, specifically a sealed section that had only recently been opened for historical preservation. The historian, a woman with a perpetually dusty tweed jacket and an air of quiet fascination, had been initially hesitant. "It's not exactly a research facility, Raj," he'd said, his voice echoing faintly in the vast, echoing nave of the cathedral above. Or perhaps she simply sensed the nascent obsession that already clung to me like a shroud. The descent was a journey into a different kind of night. The scent was a mixture of ancient stone, dry earth, and a faint, sweet decay that hinted at centuries of slumber. My footsteps, usually measured, seemed to crack like gunshots against the flagstones of the cathedral's main crypt, before softening to a dull shuffle as I navigated the winding passages. The ceiling was lower, the rough-hewn stone walls sweating with condensation. They installed custom-built server racks, shielded cables, and the sensitive receiving arrays I'd designed. The hum of the new equipment, a stark contrast to the ancient stillness, was now the only sound, a fragile barrier against the profound quiet that pressed in from every direction. The air here felt denser, heavier, almost as if it resisted sound, absorbed it. My breath plumed in front of me. The raw data streamed across my main monitor, a shimmering cascade of complex patterns. I had spent weeks filtering out cosmic background radiation, solar flares, terrestrial interference, everything that could possibly account for the signal. Now, here in this subterranean vault, the signal was cleaner, sharper, its inherent structure laid bare. I zoomed in, then out, running algorithms I'd painstakingly developed. It wasn't a simple pulse sequence, no obvious binary code. It wasn't even a complex, chaotic system that could be explained by natural forces. Instead, what unfolded before me was a tapestry of interwoven frequencies, a symphony of mathematical impossibilities. There were repeating motifs, yes, but they shifted, evolved, layered upon themselves in ways that defied any known form of communication. It wasn't like human language or even the elegant simplicity of a prime number sequence. It was something more, something fundamentally different. I ran a pattern recognition program, one designed to detect non-randomness in vast datasets. The results flashed green, then amber, then a definitive red, 99. 99% likelihood of intelligent, non-random origin. My breath hitched. The screen pulsed with the signal's intricate dance, each ripple and surge a deliberate choice, an impossible statement. It wasn't just a pattern, it was design. But what kind of design? It wasn't transmitting information I could decipher, no recognizable language, no images, no mathematical constants I could isolate. It was pure structure, pure intent, manifesting as a complex energy signature that defied every principle of physics I held sacred. It used no detectable carrier wave, yet it was a wave. It consumed no measurable energy, yet it was energy. The air in the catacombs seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. My eyes burned from staring at the screens, but I couldn't tear them away. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an unveiling. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to run through the stone floor beneath my feet, not from my equipment, but from somewhere deeper, older. What kind of intelligence could exist beyond the very laws that governed our universe? And what did it want with me, with us, now that it had made itself known? The air in the catacombs beneath Cathedral, sealed section opened, hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else. Something ancient and mineral, like rusted iron mixed with forgotten incense. My small team moved with practiced efficiency, their headlamps carving shifting tunnels of light through the perpetual gloom. The rough-hewn stone walls, slick with condensation, seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the low hum of our portable generator and the delicate click-whir of the signal processing equipment. This confined space, barely large enough for our setup, felt less like an archaeological find and more like a forgotten chamber, holding its breath. I hunched over the main console, my gaze fixed on the glowing waveform. The signal was still there, unwavering, a stark line of impossible complexity against the background static. It pulsed with a rhythm that defied conventional understanding, a steady, alien beat emanating from the vast emptiness I'd identified. I tried to filter out the extraneous noise, to isolate the pure, raw data, but a new, subtle interference had begun to manifest. A technician near the power inverter grunted. "My tablet just rebooted, sir, again." He tapped the screen, a frown etched into his face. "Third time in an hour, never had an issue with this unit." I waved a dismissive hand, my focus still on the signal. Just the damp, I expect, or the age of the wiring down here. We were, after all, deep beneath an incredibly old structure. But even as I said it, a faint flicker ran through the overhead LED strip, barely perceptible, a ghost of a blink. Then, the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the generator, usually a steady drone, seemed to stutter, a momentary dip in its deep mechanical respiration. It recovered instantly, but the tiny disruption snagged at my attention. My fingers, usually so precise, felt clumsy as I adjusted a dial. A cold seeped into my bones that had nothing to do with the catacomb's ambient temperature. The low, resonant echo of the sealed section seemed to deepen, to take on a quality I couldn't quite place. It wasn't merely the sound of our equipment bouncing off stone. It felt like a larger space, a cavern beyond our immediate perception, was subtly resonating with our presence, or perhaps with something else. I glanced up, sweeping my gaze across the ancient stone. For a split second, the far wall seemed to ripple, a fluid distortion like heat haze, before snapping back into its solid, unyielding reality. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Just fatigue, I told myself. The long hours, the crushing pressure. But then a technician called out, "Sir, the primary data feed just dropped out for half a second. Lost a packet." His voice was tight with frustration. I stalked over to his station. The diagnostic screen glowed an angry red where the error had occurred. "Interference," I muttered, more to myself than to him. But from what? The signal from the void continued its steady, impassable thrum. It felt heavier now, more insistent, as if it were pressing down on the very air around us. The subtle hum of our equipment began to take on a different timbre, a low, discordant note weaving through its usual drone. It was like a cello string vibrating almost imperceptibly out of tune, creating a dissonance that scraped at the edges of my hearing. Later that evening, after the team had packed up the most sensitive equipment and left me with the basic monitoring stations, I found myself drawn to the cathedral's ancient library. It was a dusty, forgotten annex, smelling of parchment and dry rot, a place rarely disturbed. The signal, even through the thick stone, seemed to pull me, a subtle magnetic force. If what I was detecting was truly beyond physics, perhaps its history was beyond science too. I pulled down heavy, leather-bound tomes, their pages brittle and yellowed. Most were theological tracts, historical records of forgotten bishops, or illuminated manuscripts of little scientific interest. But then, tucked away on a high shelf behind a row of psalters, I found a collection of bound scrolls and fragmented texts, written in a language that was archaic even by the library's standards. The script was spidery, almost pictographic in places, and the Latin interspersed within it was corrupt, hinting at a much older root. One particular scroll, its vellum cracked with age, caught my eye. The text described visions of impassable geometries and colors unseen by mortal eyes, followed by the erosion of sanity and the dissolution of the self. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that bloomed into a throbbing. The faint scent of ozone, sharp and metallic, tickled my nostrils. I looked around the empty library. No electrical storms outside, no exposed wiring. It was a smell I'd noticed briefly in the catacombs earlier. It was gone, replaced by the familiar stacks of books. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hands trembled, causing the ancient scroll to rustle like dry leaves. Was I truly seeing things now, or was the signal, the presence, somehow bleeding into my reality, subtly altering the very air I breathed, the light I saw? What did dissolution of the self truly mean? The pressure behind my eyes didn't dissipate with the morning light. It settled into a dull, persistent ache, a subtle throb that echoed the faint ringing in my ears. The metallic tang of ozone still lingered, a phantom scent that clung to my sinuses despite the open window. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a residual effect of the day's strange events, but a chill traced its way down my spine. That smell, I knew, I remembered, had been strongest in the catacombs beneath Cathedral, sealed section opened. It had been a physical presence down there, a sharp, almost electrical charge in the air, not just a vague scent. Sleep offered no respite. The moment my head hit the pillow, the dreams began, not as flickering images, but as full sensory assaults. I was adrift in a space that wasn't dark, but rather an absence of light, a void that pressed in on me from all sides. Shapes materialized from this nothingness, geometries that defied logic. They weren't constructed of lines and angles I recognized, but of impassable curves that twisted back on themselves, shifting and reforming with an agonizing slowness. A structure would appear, intricate and vast, then suddenly invert, its interior becoming its exterior, revealing patterns that made my brain recoil. I felt a profound nausea, a deep-seated revulsion not just at what I saw, but at the implication of it. Then came the presence. It wasn't a form I could perceive, no eyes, no limbs, no discernible features. It was a feeling, an overwhelming weight of incomprehensible scale and antiquity. It simply was. I felt it observing me, not with curiosity, but with the indifferent regard one might give to an ant. The sheer, crushing indifference of something so utterly beyond human comprehension was more terrifying than any monster. My lungs seized, a silent scream trapped in my throat, my limbs heavy with a paralysis that wasn't physical, but existential. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping, the taste of ash in my mouth. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape its cage. The dreams continued for days, each more vivid, more disturbing than the last. The impassable geometries became more complex, the sense of the vast presence more acute. The lines between waking and dreaming began to blur. It started subtly, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I'd be reading a paper, focused on equations, and suddenly a sliver of an impassable angle would manifest in the corner of my eye. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and it would be gone. Just my mind playing tricks, I told myself, a byproduct of sleep deprivation. But then the distortions grew bolder. I was in the university library, poring over historical texts, looking for any mention of strange occurrences, any forgotten lore that might hint at what I was experiencing. I looked up, needing a moment to rest my eyes, and the ornate ceiling above me seemed to ripple. Not a physical ripple, but a visual one, as if the very air had become viscous. The intricate plasterwork shifted, the familiar patterns dissolving into a fleeting glimpse of those alien angles from my dreams. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars danced behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the ceiling was normal, perfectly still. A tremor ran through me. This wasn't just in my mind anymore. This was bleeding into the world around me. I started to notice the ozone smell more frequently, a sharp, metallic tang that would suddenly appear, then vanish, leaving me disoriented. It was no longer confined to my memory of the catacombs. It was a herald of these waking distortions. One afternoon, while I was back in my lab, staring at the faint, consistent blip of the signal on my monitor, the room seemed to stretch. The walls bowed inward, then outward, like a breath taken by something impassably large. My hands clenched on the desk, gripped tight. The monitor, displaying its steady stream of data, suddenly flickered, and for a terrifying instant, the complex waveform of the signal seemed to morph into one of those impassable symbols from my dreams, a glyph that held no meaning yet radiated profound menace. I pulled back, stumbling away from the desk, my chair scraping loudly across the floor. My heart was a drum against my ribs, an insistent, terrified beat. My vision swam, the lab lights appearing to pulse and dim erratically, though I knew they were steady. I felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if my own body was no longer quite aligned with reality. Was this what the signal did? Was it not just broadcasting information, but rewriting the very rules of perception? I stumbled out of the lab, needing air, needing distance from the relentless, creeping intrusion. Every corner I turned felt like a gamble, a test of whether the world would hold its shape. My hands trembled. My throat was dry. I felt an irrational urge to return to the catacombs beneath Cathedral, sealed section opened, to confront the source of that original ozone smell, to see if the sealed section itself now pulsed with the same impassable energies that were tearing at my mind. But what would I find there? And would I ever truly return from it? I tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to exhaustion, but the truth felt heavier, colder. Something had shifted profoundly, and I couldn't unshift it. I knew I had to share what I'd found. The implications were too vast, too paradigm-shattering to keep to myself. I meticulously prepared my presentation, stripping away every hint of my personal experience, attempting to present only the raw data, the irrefutable anomalies, the signal's impassable age, its non-local origin, the intricate, self-referential patterns that defied every known principle of information theory. I rehearsed my calmest tone, my most objective demeanor, trying to bury the frantic certainty that now hummed beneath my skin. The meeting room was sterile, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The faces of my colleagues, usually keen and engaged, seemed guarded, their expressions carefully neutral. I started projecting the spectral analysis, the inexplicable energy signatures. I explained the void, the sheer, impassable emptiness from which the signal emanated. My voice, I thought, was steady, professional, but as I spoke, the ringing in my ears intensified, a high, thin whine that only I seemed to hear. I found myself gesturing more emphatically than I intended, leaning closer to the projector screen as if to physically push them into understanding. A senior researcher, his brow furrowed, interrupted me. "Raj, are you suggesting this is an intelligence from outside the universe?" His tone was laced with a skepticism that bordered on pity. "It's not outside in a spatial sense," I corrected, my patience fraying. "It's from a region of absolute cosmic absence, a place where our physics simply doesn't apply, and the patterns, they are too complex, too self-aware to be anything but a deliberate communication, a presence." A colleague at the back shifted uneasily. "Raj, your sleep schedule has been erratic, hasn't it? Perhaps you're seeing patterns where there are none. The human mind is remarkably good at finding order in chaos." Their words felt like a physical assault, a cold water splash. They weren't hearing the data, they were seeing me, my slightly bloodshot eyes, perhaps the tremor in my hand as I navigated the slides, the sheer intensity that I couldn't quite mask. I saw the glances exchanged, the subtle shakes of heads. They weren't just dismissing my findings, they were dismissing me. "This isn't about my well-being," I insisted, my voice rising. "This is about a fundamental truth about our universe that we are utterly unprepared for. It's a truth that predates everything we thought we knew." The meeting ended abruptly. The senior researcher suggested I take some time off, clear my head. No one stayed to discuss the implications. No one asked for a deeper dive into the raw data. They simply filed out, leaving me alone in the humming room, the ghostly glow of my impassable signal still projected onto the screen. I was an anomaly, not the signal, an isolated variable to be contained and ignored. If they wouldn't listen to science, perhaps there were other avenues. If the truth was so ancient, so incomprehensible, maybe it had been glimpsed before, whispered in forgotten corners of human history. My search, initially confined to astronomical databases and theoretical physics papers, now veered sharply. I began to seek out texts that spoke of things beyond the veil, not as metaphor, but as veiled reality. Obscure philosophies, ancient cosmologies, forgotten myths that touched upon entities from beyond the known. A place rarely spoken of, and then only in hushed tones, rumored to hold texts deemed too dangerous, too unsettling for common eyes. It took weeks of persistent inquiry, of navigating bureaucratic labyrinths and convincing reluctant gatekeepers to gain access. My desperation must have been palpable, my eyes holding a flicker of something they couldn't quite place, but they eventually relented. I found myself descending into the earth, the air growing heavy and cool with each step. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of forgotten feet. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying parchment, and something else, something subtly metallic and ancient, a smell that prickled at the back of my throat. It was a smell I was beginning to associate with profound, unsettling knowledge. Finally, a heavy, iron-bound door groaned open, revealing a passage that twisted deeper still. This was it. The catacombs beneath Cathedral sealed section opened. My small flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing shelves carved directly into the rock walls, overflowing with scrolls and bound volumes that crumbled at the slightest touch. I moved slowly, my breath misting in the frigid air. The silence was profound, broken only by the scuff of my shoes and the rapid thump of my own heart. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the spines of books written in languages I barely recognized, adorned with symbols that seemed to writhe in the periphery of my vision. And then I found them. These weren't scientific papers, but they spoke a language I was beginning to understand. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a pressure, a vast, unseen weight settling into the corners of the catacombs. Was it just the ancient structure settling, or was something else stirring in this forgotten place, awakened by my forbidden curiosity? The senior researcher's dismissal had left a bitter taste, a metallic tang on my tongue. They hadn't just rejected my findings, they'd rejected the very possibility of them. The faint, persistent hum of the lab equipment had marked me as I stood alone, the impassable signal still painting its jagged, alien patterns across my console, a silent testament to a truth no one wanted to hear. They wanted me to clear my head. I just needed to clear the noise. Their skepticism, their comfortable ignorance, only fueled my resolve. If they wouldn't look, I would look deeper. I needed a space untainted by their preconceptions, a place where the ancient whispers of the signal wouldn't be drowned out by the sterile drone of modern thought. My mind, unbidden, kept returning to an old, half-forgotten architectural survey. I'd once stumbled upon a mention of a sub-level beneath the city's oldest cathedral, a section rumored to have been sealed centuries ago, forgotten even by the custodians. A place of deep, undisturbed quiet. A place where echoes might still linger. It took me 3 days of careful, almost obsessive research, poring over faded blueprints and hushed historical accounts to locate the entry point. Another night of patient, precise work with borrowed tools to bypass the ancient, rusted mechanisms. The air that greeted me was thick and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth, crumbling lime mortar, and something else, something vaguely mineral, like iron ore and forgotten dust. My breath plumed in the cold, narrow passage as I finally pushed past the last obstruction, a massive stone slab that scraped a protesting groan across the silence. And then I was in the catacombs, beneath the cathedral, sealed section opened. The ceiling dripped with a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mark the passage of geological time, each drop echoing unnaturally in the vast, still chamber. My boots crunched on scattered debris, loose pebbles, fragments of dried clay, and what felt like older, finer dust. The signal, which I'd meticulously recorded and isolated, now pulsed on the display, a vibrant, impassable calligraphy amidst the ancient stone. I'd spent weeks trying to apply every known linguistic and mathematical framework, every pattern recognition algorithm I could devise. Nothing. It was like trying to understand the roar of a distant ocean by dissecting a single drop of water. But here, in this suffocating quiet, something felt different. I adjusted the parameters, not seeking patterns anymore, but resonances. I wasn't looking for a language to be translated, but a frequency to be felt. My fingers moved almost instinctively across the interface, guided by an intuition that felt both alien and profoundly mine. I was no longer an observer, I was a conduit. The signal wasn't just data, it was a presence, a weight in the air, a hum in my teeth. Hours bled into a timeless continuum. My eyes burned, my shoulders ached, but I couldn't stop. The drips from the ceiling became a metronome, counting down to something. I felt a growing pressure behind my eyes, a dull throb that intensified with each subtle adjustment to the algorithms. It wasn't logic I was applying now, but a desperate, almost primal urge to connect. And then it happened. Not a sudden flash, not a clear translation. It was a descent. A cascade of pure, unadulterated concepts flooded my mind, bypassing my eyes and ears, seeping directly into the deepest wells of my consciousness. It wasn't words. It wasn't images. It was raw, unmediated truth, downloaded with a force that buckled my knees. I saw, or rather, understood, the universe not as a grand, ordered mechanism, but as an incidental byproduct, a fleck of dust on a vast, indifferent canvas. Our sun, our galaxy, everything we held dear, was less than a momentary ripple in a cosmic ocean whose true depths were unfathomable, whose currents were driven by forces beyond any conception of physics or time. Humanity, our struggles, our triumphs, our brief, flickering existence, it was nothing, less than nothing, a bacterial bloom on a single, forgotten grain of sand. The sheer, overwhelming insignificance of it all choked me. My throat tightened, air suddenly scarce. And then came the understanding of them, not beings with form or name, but vast, slumbering presences. Not evil, not benevolent, but simply are. They didn't govern the cosmos. They were the cosmos, or perhaps the dream within which the cosmos unfolded. And we, all of us, were merely the briefest, most accidental of thoughts in their incomprehensible slumber. Their awareness of us was less than our awareness of a single, dying cell in our own bodies. We were an irritation, a fleeting disturbance in their ancient, endless repose. My hands, still hovering over the console, began to tremble uncontrollably. The air felt heavy, pressing down, as if the very space around me had become aware of the terrible truth I now held. The dripping water seemed to slow, each resonant plink a hammer blow against the fragile shell of my sanity. My breath hitched. The signal on the console wasn't just patterns anymore. It felt like it was looking back, a vast, ancient eye now fully open, peering through the window I had so foolishly opened into my own mind. What had I awakened? The faint, persistent hum of the lab equipment had marked me as I stood alone, the impassable signal still painting its jagged form across my monitors. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a whisper in the back of my mind, a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. The world outside the lab, the world of grants and peer review, felt distant, almost irrelevant. My real work was here, with the signal, with the truth it promised. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. The idea of closing my eyes, of surrendering to unconsciousness, felt like a betrayal of the signal. Every moment I wasn't analyzing, I was thinking about it, feeling its pull. My reflection in the dark glass of the monitor showed a stranger. Eyes ringed with purple, skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, a faint tremor in my hands. The smell of stale coffee and my own unwashed clothes clung to me, but I barely registered it. Food was an afterthought, a mechanical act to keep the body going, nothing more. What did the body matter when the mind was on the verge of something so much larger? The signal was changing me, I knew it. Not just my habits, but something deeper. The deciphered fragments, the patterns I'd teased out of the cosmic static, weren't just information. They were directives, Or perhaps, more accurately, they were keys, slowly unlocking chambers in my own mind I hadn't known existed. The world began to feel thin, like a veil stretched taut. I started noticing things. A flicker in the fluorescent lights that wasn't a flicker at all. A subtle shift in the pattern of wood grain on my desk, like it was breathing. Were these just the effects of sleep deprivation, or was the signal granting me a new kind of sight? The pull grew stronger, more specific. It wasn't just a general urge to understand. It was a physical direction, a faint, almost subliminal hum guiding me. It led me away from the sterile, familiar paths of the university, through the older parts of the city, past buildings that seemed to lean with age. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and forgotten things. I'd never paid much attention to the cathedral before, just another landmark. But now, its weathered stone seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible thrum, a resonance with the signal. It felt old, not just centuries old, but profoundly, cosmically old. The kind of old that predates memory. It led me to a narrow, seldom-used door tucked away behind a confessional, a door I'd probably walked past 100 times without seeing. It stood slightly ajar, as if waiting. The air immediately grew thick, laden with the smell of mildew, dust, and something else. A faint, metallic scent that reminded me of the taste in my mouth after the senior researcher's dismissal. Each step down felt like a step back in time, or perhaps out of it entirely. Finally, the stairs opened into a vast, cavernous space. This was it. The catacombs beneath the cathedral, a sealed section opened. I didn't know how it had been opened or by whom. I just knew I was meant to be here. Rows upon rows of niches, each containing skeletal remains, stretched into the gloom, some sealed with crumbling stone tablets, others gaping empty. The silence was not empty. It vibrated with a low, almost subsonic hum, a chorus of forgotten breaths. My breath hitched in my chest. The air was heavy, pressing in on me, and I could taste the dust of ages on my tongue. It was here, in this echoing crypt, that the distortions intensified. The faint, almost imperceptible shifts I'd noticed in the lab became undeniable. The bones in their niches appeared to rearrange themselves, just at the periphery of my vision, the angles of skulls subtly changing, jawbones shifting into impassable grins. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The walls were solid again, the bones still, but the memory of their movement lingered, a persistent afterimage on my retinas. This place felt like a nerve ending of the earth, connected to something vast and slumbering beneath. My own heartbeat seemed to slow, synchronize with that ancient rhythm. I wasn't just seeing things, I was feeling them. The boundaries between my senses blurred. The detachment that had begun in the lab deepened here. The world of human concerns, of my career, of my colleagues, felt like a distant, fading dream. Their dismissal of my findings, their stubborn adherence to a reality I now knew was only a thin veneer, struck me as utterly pathetic. How could they not see it? How could they not feel the universe pressing in, revealing its true, monstrous face? My own physical discomfort, the hunger, the exhaustion, had become irrelevant. All that mattered was this new perception, this terrible clarity. I walked deeper into the catacombs, drawn by an invisible current, until I reached a section where the niches were carved into the living rock itself, not built-up masonry. And then I saw it. On the rough-hewn wall, where the rock met an impassably smooth, jet-black surface that absorbed all light, there was a pattern. It wasn't carved or painted. It was there, an inherent part of the surface, yet it shifted, unfurled, like a blooming flower caught in a time-lapse, only it wasn't a flower. It was a geometry that defied Euclidean space, lines folding into themselves, angles that couldn't exist, all without moving, yet in constant flux. My breath hitched. This was the signal. Not a representation, not data, but the signal itself, manifested. It hummed, not with sound, but with pure meaning, pouring directly into my mind. It was a truth so vast, so alien that it twisted my stomach into knots, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. The world outside, the one I had known, the one they still clung to, was a lie. A comfortable, fragile lie. And this impassable geometry, was the tear in the fabric. What other truths lay just beyond the edge of what I could perceive? The faint, persistent hum of the lab equipment had marked me as I stood alone, the impassable signal still painting its jagged, alien signature across the screens. But their disbelief, their casual dismissal, had only hardened something inside me. It wasn't an anomaly. It couldn't be. I spent the next few days in a blur, the lab my only companion, the signal my relentless focus. My eyes burned, gritty from lack of sleep. Coffee had become a constant drip, a bitter companion to the growing certainty that festered in my mind. The signal wasn't just there. It was aware. It wasn't a passive emanation, a cosmic beacon accidentally caught. No, the patterns, subtle shifts I'd initially dismissed as noise or interference, now coalesced into something far more deliberate. There was a rhythm, an inflection, a purpose to its impassable dance. It was a cold, quiet dawn when the realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The signal wasn't just being observed, it was observing. And more terrifyingly, it was calling. A faint, almost imperceptible tug, like an invisible thread tightening around my consciousness, pulling me in. It wasn't a voice in my head, not a whisper. This wasn't merely data anymore. This was a presence, reaching out directly to me. The lab, once a sanctuary of logic and reason, now felt exposed, too bright, too public. Every flickering fluorescent tube, every distant murmur of a colleague, felt like an intrusion. I needed isolation. I needed a place where the air was thick with forgotten things, where the very stones held secrets that dwarfed even the cosmos. A forbidden space, perfect for what I intended. It took a week of discreet inquiries, a few well-placed favors, and a substantial amount of fabricated academic pretense to gain access to the old cathedral archives. The archivist, a stooped woman with spectacles perched on her nose, had eyed me with suspicion, but eventually relented, pointing vaguely towards a dusty, disused stairwell behind a crumbling wall of ancient texts. The stairwell spiraled down, past crude carvings and fading frescoes, until it ended at a heavy, iron-banded door, covered in a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs. This was it. The catacombs beneath the cathedral, sealed section opened. The rusty bolts groaned like tortured souls as I forced them back, the ancient hinges screaming in protest. A gust of stale, earthy air, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something mineral and forgotten, billowed out, stirring the dust motes in my flashlight beam. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The space was vast, a labyrinth of rough-hewn stone passages and vaulted chambers, lined with niches that once held the bones of the long dead. This was a place of endings, of finality, yet I felt an undeniable pull, a resonance with the signal that seemed to deepen here, away from the sterile hum of modern life. Over the next few days, I worked like a madman, hauling modified equipment from the lab under the cover of night. Specialized amplifiers, custom-built filters, an array of sensory input devices designed not to merely observe the signal, but to interface with it on a deeper, more direct level. I bypassed all the standard protocols, all the safety measures. This wasn't about data collection anymore. It was about connection. Wires snaked across the damp stone floor, connecting me to the heart of the impassable signal. My head throbbed, a dull ache that had become a constant companion. The air, heavy and still, seemed to press in on me. I adjusted the final dial, the faint glow of the indicators painting my face in an eerie green light. This experiment, I knew, was beyond reckless. It was an act of pure, unadulterated hubris. I was attempting to force open a door that was never meant to be breached, to amplify a connection that threatened to unravel the very threads of my sanity. My fingers hovered over the activation switch, my pulse hammering against my ribs. What would happen when I truly opened myself to the source? The faint, persistent hum of the lab equipment had marked me as I stood alone, the impassable signal still painting its jagged, incomprehensible patterns across my console. Their skepticism, their outright scorn, had not extinguished my resolve. It had sharpened it, honed it into a desperate, singular focus. If they wouldn't look, then I would look harder, deeper, until there was no turning back. I couldn't stay in the lab. The sterile walls, the too bright lights, the constant threat of interruption, it all felt constricting, like a coffin lid slowly lowering. I needed a place where the air was thick with forgotten things, where the very stones hummed with a different kind of silence. a place where the echo of human history was long, but not so long that it drowned out something far older. My mind, restless and buzzing with the signal's insistent whisper, settled on a rumor, a half-forgotten tale of a sealed section beneath the city's oldest cathedral. A place meant to keep things in, or perhaps out. The journey was a blur of calculated movements. I packed only the essentials, my modified signal receiver, a specialized amplifier I'd built in secret, and a few power cells. The weight of the equipment felt like a covenant, a promise to myself. The city lights, usually a comforting blanket, now seemed flimsy, a thin illusion draped over something vast and indifferent. I moved through the deserted streets under a sky bruised purple with distant light pollution, air cool, and carrying the faint, earthy scent of impending rain. My breath plumed in front of me, quick and shallow, half hidden by overgrown ivy at the very edge of the cathedral grounds. The gate creaked open like a dying throat, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that plunged into absolute blackness. The walls, where my light found them, were rough-hewn stone, slick with condensation. Cobwebs, thick and heavy, brushed against my face, leaving a clammy residue on my skin. I pushed deeper past alcoves where ancient, crumbling sarcophagi rested, their stone lids cracked open like empty mouths. A sense of immense age pressed down on me, not just of centuries, but of millennia. Finally, I reached it. The catacombs beneath cathedral sealed section opened. The opened part was recent, a rough-hewn break in a wall of much older, more expertly laid stones. The opening was just wide enough for me to squeeze through, my pack snagging on jagged edges. No sarcophagi here, no human remnants. The air here was different too, devoid of the usual mustiness, replaced by an odd, metallic tang, like ozone, but deeper, more fundamental. I set up my equipment quickly, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. The signal receiver hummed to life, its interface glowing a soft, sickly green. I connected the amplifier, feeling a jolt of anticipation, a nervous energy that vibrated through my bones. I adjusted the frequencies, pushing the limits of the device, reaching for the impossible. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen pressure. Then the static began to clear. The jagged patterns on my screen resolved into something terrifyingly coherent. It wasn't an image, not in any sense I understood. It was a logic. A vast, intricate weave of information that bypassed my visual cortex, my auditory nerves, and went straight to the core of my being. My mind reeled. I felt a sudden, profound vertigo, as if the floor beneath me had tilted 90 degrees, then another 90. The chamber seemed to expand, then contract, the stone walls breathing. This was its form. Not a body, not a shape, but a presence so immense it dwarfed galaxies, not in size, but in conceptual weight. It was a consciousness that had never known a beginning, that had watched universes bloom and wither like ephemeral flowers. I was not seeing it with my eyes, but experiencing it with every neuron, every atom of my being. It was a symphony of impossible geometries, a silent roar of unfathomable knowledge. My sense of self, of Raj, the astrophysicist, began to fray at the edges, dissolving into the overwhelming current of its existence. I understood then. This entity, this cosmic intelligence, wasn't merely observing. It was acting. Its purpose wasn't malevolent, not in a human way, but utterly indifferent. It was a force of slow, inevitable reshaping. Reality, as I knew it, was merely a malleable substance, a clay in its incomprehensible grasp. Humanity, our triumphs, our struggles, our very existence, was nothing more than an ephemeral dust mote, an accidental pattern on a canvas it was methodically, timelessly repainting. We were irrelevant. Our universe was merely a fleeting thought, a momentary configuration that could be altered, erased, or fundamentally transformed at a whim beyond our comprehension. My breath hitched. A ragged gasp caught in my throat. My limbs trembled uncontrollably, a violent shiver that felt like my skeleton trying to shake free of my flesh. My eyes, wide and unfocused, burned with the strain of seeing something that was not meant to be seen. The metallic tang in the air intensified, tasting of old blood and starlight. I felt a primal urge to scream, but no sound would come. The sheer, crushing weight of its indifference was suffocating. I was nothing, Everything I knew was nothing. I tore my gaze from the screen, my hands fumbling for the amplifier's power switch. The effort was immense, like pulling myself free from a tar pit. With a desperate lurch, I cut the connection. It was filled with the echoes of what I had just perceived, reverberating through the very fabric of my mind. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of an infinitely silent, infinitely vast cosmic design. What had I truly witnessed, and what was I supposed to do now that I knew? The metallic tang of the senior researcher's dismissal had long since faded, replaced by a much fouler taste, a cloying mineral bitterness that clung to the back of my throat. It was the taste of ancient dust, of damp stone, and something profoundly wrong. I stood in the catacombs beneath a cathedral, a sealed section opened only days ago, its yawning more exhaling air that felt thicker than water, heavy with the weight of centuries, and something far, far older. My breath plumed in the cold, visible in the beam of my single headlamp. The air here was still, yet it felt alive, vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum that resonated deep in my bones. It wasn't the sterile thrum of lab equipment. This was an organic resonance, like a sleeping behemoth's slow, deep breath. The rough-hewn walls, slick with condensation, pressed in on me, their surfaces etched with forgotten symbols I couldn't decipher, but which seemed to writhe at the periphery of my vision. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce into momentary forms that vanished when I turned my lamp directly on them. I had come here seeking, I told myself, a different kind of archive. The sterile confines of the laboratory felt insufficient, almost a deliberate blind spot. This place, consecrated by human belief for millennia, yet rooted in the Earth's raw geology, seemed a more fitting crucible for the truths I now suspected. The sealed section, discovered by sheer accident during routine structural assessments, had called to me with an urgency that bypassed logic. It felt like a deliberate unlocking, not by human hand, but by the relentless, encroaching pressure of the entity itself. Outside, the world was changing. I'd seen it first in the subtle shifts on the weather reports, then in the growing unease among people I encountered. Now, down here, isolated by tons of earth and stone, the full scope of it began to clarify with horrifying precision. The entity wasn't just influencing me. It was seeping, bleeding into the fabric of everything. My comms device, usually a lifeline, had been mostly silent for hours. He spoke of the sky, describing it not as blue or gray, but as a bruised purple, a shade that didn't exist in any spectrum I knew. He mentioned winds that blew from no discernible direction, carrying the scent of something like ozone and distant charring, yet leaving no physical trace. He signed off abruptly, his final word a choked gasp. I clutched the device, its cold metal a small anchor in the surging tide of dread. The air in the catacombs, already heavy, grew denser, pressing against my eardrums. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the world's very consistency. My skin tingled, as if countless microscopic needles were pricking it. I was a conduit, an unwilling antenna for the unfolding cosmic horror, and the clarity it granted me was a torment. The passages here were narrower, the carvings on the walls more intricate, less like human script, and more like the sprawling veins of some colossal, petrified organism. It felt rough, abrasive, almost alive with a faint, insistent pulse. When I finally surfaced, blinking against the muted, strangely tinted daylight, the world was no longer merely uneasy. It was fractured. The sky was indeed a bruised, sickly violet orange, an impassable sunset that hung stagnant for hours. The air, despite the lack of visible particulate, tasted like metal and ash. People on the streets moved with a strange, detached listlessness, their eyes vacant or else darting with frantic, unreasoning paranoia. A vendor, usually boisterous, stood beside his cart of wilting flowers, humming a tuneless, repetitive drone, his gaze fixed on a point far above the horizon, seemingly seeing something I couldn't. The sounds of the city had changed too. Sirens wailed, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if filtered through water. Car horns blared in frustrated, meaningless bursts. But beneath it all, the most pervasive sound was the collective murmur, the same low, formless drone my colleague had described. It wasn't conversation. It was a hum, a rising chorus of unease that seemed to emanate from the very asphalt. My own mind felt stretched, thin, a membrane on the verge of tearing. I could feel the subtle shifts in the collective consciousness, the insidious tendrils of apathy and fear intertwining. A group of young men, typically loud and boisterous, sat on a bench, staring blankly ahead, their faces slack. The entity wasn't just sending a signal anymore. It was breathing life into the world, but it was a life alien and horrifying, twisting the familiar into something monstrous. The veil, I realized, was no longer merely thinning. It was dissolving, revealing the true, hideous face of a universe utterly indifferent to our existence, yet now terrifyingly aware. I walked, my legs feeling heavy, my chest tight. The world was no longer mine or ours. It was becoming theirs. And I, the one who had inadvertently opened the door, could only watch, a horrified witness to the universal unraveling. What would happen when the final threads of the veil completely disintegrated? I stood in the catacombs beneath Cathedral, sealed section opened, a place I never thought I'd see. The air was thick, heavy, pressing in on my chest, a physical weight that made each breath a conscious effort. My flashlight beam cut a wavering path through the absolute black, illuminating skeletal remains stacked neatly in niches, their vacant eye sockets seeming to follow my every move. They were old, these bones, impossibly old, not just in terms of years, but in a way that felt like time itself had worn thin around them. The bitterness on my tongue intensified, a metallic tang that made my teeth ache. I could feel the grit of the ancient dust on my skin, a fine, pervasive powder that seemed to seep into my pores. It wasn't just dirt. It felt like powdered history, ground down by an unbearable pressure. The signal, that impassable resonance from beyond the void, felt stronger here, a thrumming in my bones that wasn't sound but pure sensation. It vibrated through the very soles of my shoes, up my legs, settling deep in my skull, a low, persistent hum that drowned out my own thoughts. I pushed deeper, my determination a brittle shield against the escalating dread. The passageway narrowed, the stone walls closing in, slick with a perpetual dampness. The light from my flashlight began to flicker, not erratically, but in a strange, rhythmic pulse that didn't match any electrical fault I knew. It was as if the light was responding to the unseen thrum, dimming and brightening in sync with that silent vibration. Then I saw it, not a thing, not an object, but a change in the architecture. Ahead, where the tunnel should have continued straight, the passage seemed to fold. The stone didn't curve, it simply bent, at an angle no structure should naturally take. A corner appeared where no corner could logically exist, turning into itself, receding into a perspective that defied Euclidean geometry. My mind screamed at the impossibility, yet my eyes registered it plainly. My breath hitched. I stretched out a hand, my fingers trembling towards the warped stone. When my fingertips finally brushed the surface, it wasn't the rough, damp stone I expected. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like polished obsidian, but somehow also soft, yielding slightly under my touch before snapping back with a subtle, resilient tension. I pulled back sharply, a gasp escaping my lips, my mind struggling to reconcile the sensory input with any known reality. This wasn't just ancient, it was alien to the very concept of matter. The humming in my skull surged, a sudden, almost painful crescendo. A profound, crushing pressure descended, not just on my body, but on my very awareness. A low, guttural moan echoed from somewhere deep within the impassable angles, a sound that wasn't human, yet carried a profound sorrow, an ancient, cosmic grief. It resonated with the hum in my head, a duet of despair. My knees buckled. This wasn't just a place of the dead. It was a gateway, a membrane thinning between what was and what shouldn't be. I felt a sudden, profound loneliness, not just my own, but a collective, crushing isolation that seemed to ripple through the very air. It was as if the world outside, the world of sunlight and noise and human faces, was suddenly very far away, receding into an unreachable memory. I could feel something shifting, not just the stone, but the very fabric of perception. My ears strained, trying to pick out any sound, any indication of what was happening, but there was nothing. Only the persistent, silent thrumming that was now so loud it felt like it was ripping my skull apart. My skin crawled, My hair bristled, not from fear, but from a profound, primal recognition of something utterly vast and utterly indifferent. This wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a presence, and it was awake. What would it do, now that it had stretched its impassably ancient limbs into our world? I stood in the catacombs beneath Cathedral, sealed section opened, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on my lungs. My hand, still numb from the cold, brushed against a rough-hewn wall. Not stone, not entirely. It felt like compressed ash or petrified moss, crumbling slightly under my touch, leaving a fine, dark grit on my fingertips. It wasn't merely the absence of light. It was an active presence, a viscous, palpable weight that seemed to absorb the meager beam of my flashlight. The light struggled, a weak, flickering defiance against an older, deeper gloom. The beam revealed not familiar crypts, but a series of narrow, winding passages carved with an unsettling regularity, as if by something that understood geometry in a way my mind could not grasp. The angles were subtly off, the lines not quite parallel, creating an optical distortion that made my eyes ache. My vision swam, the walls seeming to breathe, to recede and advance with a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the growing pulse in my temples. A low hum began, not from the signal receiver I clutched, but from the very air around me. It vibrated in my teeth, a deep, resonant tone that felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure, like being submerged in deep water. It wasn't the precise, mathematical thrum of the cosmic signal I had chased for so long. This was organic, earthy, yet utterly alien. It smelled like wet soil and something metallic, like old blood mixed with ozone, a scent that caught in my sinuses and made my eyes water. I moved forward, compelled by a force stronger than curiosity, stronger than fear. My legs felt heavy, as if dragging through unseen mud. Each step was a deliberate effort, the uneven floor catching at my boots. The hum intensified, growing from a vibration to a song, a complex, dissonant chorus sung by unseen voices, yet without a discernible source. It was everywhere and nowhere, inside me and outside me. They pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly green light that seemed to ebb and flow with the rhythm of the hum. As I watched, mesmerized, one of the larger formations seemed to breathe, a slow, almost imperceptible expansion and contraction that displaced the dust motes in the air. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my skull, directly behind my eyes. It wasn't a headache. It was as if something was pushing out from within, trying to pry open my very perception. My vision fractured, the green light from the wall formations blooming into intricate, geometric patterns that overlaid my sight, shimmering like oil on water. I saw not just the catacomb walls, but through them, past them, into depths that defied spatial logic. I saw the earth, not as a solid sphere, but as a living, breathing entity, its core a churning, conscious furnace, its crust a thin, fragile skin. The hum shifted, changed. It was no longer dissonant. It resolved into a single, overwhelming note, a chord that resonated with the very fabric of my being. It was the signal, but amplified, unfiltered, direct. It bypassed my ears, my mind, and went straight to my bones, to the deepest recesses of my cells. It wasn't information, it was being. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Not from fear, but from a strange, overwhelming energy that coursed through my veins, making my skin feel too tight. My fingers, still gritty from the wall, began to tingle, then to burn. I looked down, and in the dim, green light, I saw my skin ripple subtly at first, then more pronounced. The fine hairs on my arms stood on end, not from static electricity, but from something deeper, something that altered the very structure beneath. A profound sense of detachment settled over me. Raj, the astrophysicist, the man who chased signals, was receding. His anxieties, his fears, his very identity felt like a worn-out garment slipping from my shoulders. The catacombs beneath Cathedral, sealed section opened, were no longer a location I was exploring. They were part of me, or I, part of them. The ancient dust on my tongue was not a foul taste. It was the taste of truth, of an ancient, undeniable reality. The mineral bitterness was the flavor of becoming. My breath hitched. My chest felt like it was expanding, not with air, but with something dense and heavy, something that resonated with the hum. My eyes, I knew, were changing. The world through them was no longer just matter and energy. It was pattern and resonance, a vast, intricate web of interconnectedness, each strand thrumming with the same alien song. I felt a pull, not physical, but existential, drawing me deeper into the catacombs, into the heart of the hum. My feet moved without conscious command, gliding over the uneven floor. The air was no longer heavy. My senses had reconfigured, rewired. My reflection, caught briefly in a small pool of stagnant water on the floor, was not entirely my own. My human shape was still there, but it felt like a shell, a thin veneer over something vast and unhuman, something that had been waiting, dormant for eons. The hum reached a crescendo, a silent, deafening roar within my skull. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, shattered and reformed, not broken, but reshaped into something new, something that could comprehend the incomprehensible. The cosmic truth, once a terrifying abstract, was now an intimate, undeniable reality, flowing through my altered veins. And I, Raj, was now a single, conscious node within it, forever attuned. What then was left of me, the man who had dared to listen? I stood in the catacomb, the metallic tang of the senior researcher's dismissal long since faded, replaced by a much fouler taste, a cloying mineral bitterness that clung to the back of my throat. My fingers, raw and scraped from the desperate prying, still throbbed, but I barely registered the pain. The heavy stone slab, previously an insurmountable barrier, now lay askew, revealing the entrance to a sealed section. A chill, far deeper than any subterranean draft, emanated from the newly exposed darkness. It wasn't merely cold, it was an absence, a sucking void that seemed to pull at the very heat from my body, leaving gooseflesh prickling across my arms. The air here was different too. Stale, yes, but also thick with an odor I couldn't place, a scent like ozone mixed with decaying iron and something vast, something primordial. My breath hitched. What had been sealed away for so long? Catacombs beneath the cathedral, sealed section opened, felt less like a man-made structure and more like a wound in the earth, freshly torn open. My determination, a fierce burning ember that had propelled me through years of dismissal and isolation, now flared into a reckless inferno. This was it, the source, the origin point of the signal that had haunted my waking hours and invaded my dreams. The sound was swallowed, not by distance, but by a peculiar deadness in the air, as if the very vibrations were being absorbed. The passage narrowed, the ceiling pressing down, and the stone felt slick under my fingertips, not with moisture, but with a fine, almost imperceptible grit that left a residue like powdered rust. I found myself walking deeper, my lantern now a struggling spark against an encroaching, tangible blackness. The silence was profound, yet it wasn't empty. It wasn't a sound I could hear with my ears, but one I felt in my bones, a deep, pervasive tremor that spoke of immense, slumbering power. Then the walls began to change. Not physically, not in any way my eyes could immediately discern, but their texture, their very presence, shifted. The rough-hewn stone seemed to ripple, the lantern light catching on surfaces that shouldn't have been there, brief, fleeting glimpses of something glassy and black, like obsidian, reflecting patterns that were not of this world. My mind struggled to process these visual distortions, dismissing them as tricks of the light, fatigue. But the feeling persisted, a growing certainty that the very fabric of the catacomb was being rewoven around me. A faint, almost imperceptible light began to pulse far ahead, a sickly green luminescence that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. It was the color of deep-sea algae, of something ancient and unliving. It pulsed slowly, a steady, rhythmic beat, like a colossal, alien heart. My own heart began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs, struggling to match the slow, inexorable rhythm of that other, impassable light. What was waiting at the end of this impassable passage? As I drew closer, the green light grew stronger, revealing a vast chamber, far larger than anything the cathedral's footprint should have allowed. My breath plumed in front of me, but it felt thin, insufficient. The thrumming intensified, a deep bass note that vibrated in my teeth, rattling my very skull. The chamber was not empty. At its center, bathed in the sickly green glow, was not an altar nor a sarcophagus, but a colossal, irregular mass. It wasn't carved stone, nor metal, nor any material I recognized. It was a conglomeration of impassable angles and curving surfaces that seemed to absorb the light, only to release it in shimmering, oily streaks of green. It shifted, imperceptibly, yet constantly, like a slow-motion liquid, its surface appearing to ripple with an internal current. My mind reeled. It defied geometry, defied physics. It simply was. And from it the signal, not through my equipment, not as a wave, but directly into my mind. A flood of information, not in symbols or language, but as raw, unfiltered experience. I was a mote of dust, a fleeting flicker against a backdrop of unimaginable scale. My individual existence, my memories, my very sense of self, began to fray at the edges, pulled apart by the sheer, unyielding pressure of this cosmic truth. I saw patterns, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more primal part of my being. These were not stars, not galaxies, but something else entirely. Shapes that twisted and writhed across the canvas of reality, vast entities slumbering beyond the veil, their forms so utterly alien that my brain struggled to even categorize them as beings. They were not alive in any sense I understood. They simply existed, vast, ancient, and profoundly indifferent. And the signal was not merely a broadcast, it was their awareness, a ripple in existence as they stirred. My hands flew to my head, a futile attempt to stem the tide. My body began to convulse, a desperate, animalistic response to the onslaught. The catacomb walls around me seemed to melt, the stone flowing like wax, reforming into shapes that mimicked the impassable geometry of the central mass. The green light intensified, burning into my retinas, searing away my perception of the familiar world. I was no longer in a catacomb beneath a cathedral. I was within it, within the presence, a tiny, screaming echo in an unfathomable expanse. The world outside, the world of sun and sky and human endeavor, seemed to shrink, to become a distant, fragile dream. This was reality. My thoughts fractured, scattering like dust motes in a hurricane. I was aware, but my awareness was no longer my own. It was a porous thing, bleeding into the vast consciousness that surrounded me, a consciousness that had always been there, just beyond the thin membrane of human perception. The thrumming was now a roar, tearing through the last vestiges of my sanity, stripping away everything that made me me. I fell to my knees, not in supplication, but because my legs simply ceased to function. My eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into the heart of the impassable mass, seeing not with human vision, but with a new, terrifying clarity. I was no longer a witness. I was a conduit, and the universe, the one I had known, was utterly, irrevocably transformed. Was this the end of Raj, or merely the beginning of something else?